Okay, so welcome to the penultimate workshop of the semester with ADAS. This week we've got Brendan going to taking us through some rendering on Lumion and Photoshop and just general principles of rendering and sort of creating images. So if you have any questions as we're going, just feel free to pop them into the chat as we go. And we'll make sure that we get all of them covered. And we'll have a bit of time at the end as well for any more questions you might have. So yeah, please don't hesitate to let us know. And I'll just pass you over to Brendan and we'll get started.
Okay, well, thank you much. So essentially, I'm just going to go through my own kind of routine for rendering. It's not necessarily the best or the most efficient. It's just sort of the way I like to do it and what I've learned from, just working up on it. So I'll share my screen. So just starting off, this is project I'm working on currently, but it's just to show you what you can do very quickly. So this is a Lumion render just straight out of the box from SketchUp and rendered. And then with a bit of filters, just the realistic filters, you've got a kind of decent image you can quite quickly produce. And I think that's a big benefit from Lumion, is that it's very easy to produce images quickly. So it means for reviews or tutorials, you can, if you've got a SketchUp model or a Revit model or something, you can very quickly just pass out a couple of images or a set of images for reviews or even like development work, which quickly shows your kind of understanding. And then just showing some of the work I've done. And I think the main principle for rendering is that you're not showing, it's not a technical drawing, you're not showing your building. It's like you're telling a story. It's a specific element or elements of your building. So it's like, for instance, this one, which is my last year project, the real building, there's not much of it, but it's just showing the journey towards it and atmosphere. And it's really more about setting yourself into the world where it feels like it's a real place. And again, in a similar aspect, it's not especially technical. You're not showing anything straight on, but it gives you a sense you're in the space. And I think especially if you can show your buildings when the weather isn't perfect, so it's not, your 45-degree sun, like harsh shadows, like really bright. I think it's if it's raining or cloudy or overcast, you can really kind of get the understanding of what the building might be like. I think a good place for Lumion is once you've got a realistic render, it makes it easier to go past it and to do a more post-digital render, and you can use it as a base and kind of keep going. For instance, so this is, again, back to the one I'm working on currently. It's, now combining images. So there's the rendered piece with a photo taken. So it's, you've already got that realistic base that you can then use and adapt as you please. And also these are a couple of ones I was doing for an office last summer. And it just shows it's a really good skill to have, even just to get your foot in the door a little bit. If you've got stuff that you can show off that it's kind of flashy, it's not going to like make you the best architect, but it means there's something oh, look, there's a talent, a skill that he's got or she's got. So you can quite quickly, these are all Lumion with a bit of Photoshop. So it means you can quite quickly show atmospheric images, which are really great for like client presentations or like your tutorials. I think if you can make people like feel your building and feel what it would be like to be standing there, it's really great. And there's some key principles that I always like to use, which is, so it needs to be from a human position. So if you're going for a realistic or kind of towards a realistic render, you need to be at eye level. You need to be sitting on a bench or standing in the street. And also the perspective. So it needs to feel like it's a person looking at it and it's not a wide angle or like up high, because then it doesn't look right and your brain sort of disassociates and you realize it's a computer model, it's a SketchUp model, it's not an image or painting. So then we're going on to SketchUp. So I'll be taking you through what I choose to do. I think mostly for your SketchUp models is think about if you're doing it for a render, think about where you're taking your render from. So if you're only using it as a render model, it doesn't need to be all modeled. You can have just the front elements modeled, just what you need. And I think that's really key, is that you don't have to have a full detailed model where everything's considered unless you want to. So it means if you want to just make it for this purpose, for rendering, decide beforehand what you want to render and from where. And one thing that I use a lot is the Lumion live link. So it means I've got it running right now. It means you can link the model, your SketchUp model, and your rendering program, so you can make changes live. So if I extrude something or move it up, it'll change live. You see, the material choice in SketchUp isn't especially important because you change it in Lumion. So I like to choose a neutral color for the kind of the context if you're not going to model it super in detail, and then each material, if you choose different pieces and colors. So I've chosen brickwork here, but you could just as easily make this purple and make these green, and just any color to distinguish the different materials, because you're going to go into Lumion and change them all into there. So moving into Lumion, I've taken, you can see it's the same SketchUp model, but now it's taken into Lumion, and it's glorified like a Sims game. Because so the way I like to lay it out is you have your SketchUp model, then sort of something. So I've got a section plane currently. So one thing you can do is you can cut sections, which is slightly more advanced, but it's quite quick and easy to do. And then people, cars, and trees and green space. So if I turn these both off immediately, so very quickly that makes it look a lot less realistic. And just with the addition of some cars and people, you can quickly make your image more realistic. So this is Perth Road. It was meant to be. So it's a busy street with lots of people walking down it. So it makes sense to, if I'm trying to show this scene as this lively space, kind of focusing on this main point, that it's got a busy background and foreground. So the way I would typically set up an image is, if you see, there's three, it's like in a three split. So you kind of want your image to be, or your focal point to be in the center, with a foreground which you'd put up in blur, and a background which would be slightly blurred as well. So it means that your eye is drawn into this main point, and you're selling whatever you've chosen to view. So tell the story and then show it. So I'm showing this as a busy Perth Road street, and this kind of frontage which opens up onto it.
So are these people and cars, are they from the Lumion library?
Yes. So I'll sort of start, I was thinking I'll show them. So in Lumion already, you have a number of 3D people. So if you look, so they're all, it's got kids, adults, and a range of people, and they're okay for the background, and so they move as well, so you can have motion blur, and there's people walking and sitting down and talking. And I prefer to put them towards the back of the image, because I think if some of these are up close at the front of your image, you know, it could be a bit off-putting. So I would typically put the 3D characters in the background, and then in the foreground you can either, there's two options, you can Photoshop people in later, or you can import 2D images. So if it's a PNG with a transparent background, you can import these. So essentially it's a 2D shape that it follows you around. So the way I set it up is that these ones towards the foreground, and then your 3D people, which you don't really care what they look like in the background. As well as if you're doing streetscapes, there's just a general placing, and then you can move what is the height horizontal. You can also scale it, so just rotate and then scale, so you can make it a giant or whatever. And it's the same principles with the furniture. So you've got your indoor furniture, which so all this here is built in. When you download Lumion and you get a student free year, I think you can renew it each year as long as you're still in university. So essentially, it's your imported models, which are your SketchUp ones that you've or sort of Revit or similar. Then nature. I think one of the best things about Lumion compared to other render programs is the amount of foliage, and so they have a huge range of trees and plants and wildlife. And then people, as I've shown, and then cars and lights as well. So for internals, so if I had street lights here, you can place just say like place a light, and you have the ability to adjust the brightness, the cone, as well as the direction. Which is sometimes a little bit tricky, but you can set up the scene however you please. And then, looking towards materials, Lumion has quite a good library of materials. So when you choose, you've got your your indoor, outdoor, and so various materials. And as a rule, they're sort of not bad. They're a step up above SketchUp materials, but the polygon ones are my sort of preferred. They're in more detail and they've got a bit of depth to them. So you can see. I think you want to just play around with all the settings here. So I'll run through very quickly. So essentially, colorization, as you can guess, is the color that it shows. So you want to change the material color, you want to make it blue or whatever, change it in it. So fully, it's just like so gloss is like the kind of how shiny it is, so how new it feels. So it's good for plastics, and if you want like polished bricks, then how much it reflects. So if you have more of a matte finish, relief is essentially like the kind of texture on it. It's kind of slightly hard to tell here, but you can play about this, like the depth of the material, and then scale maps, obviously, to make it as large as you please. One thing I quite like to do if I'm using brickwork is they don't always come in from the Lumion as the right size. So if you have, a piece, let's see if we can do it live. I'm not going to do anything else. Essentially, a way to scale it would be to get one piece set up. So if you ideally want to measure out one brick as an individual color. So if you get so whatever bricks you plan to use, you make sure you've got the right width and depth of it. And then so this will show the live link. So sometimes it will crash. Hopefully this won't happen now, but if you're doing like big changes to your model, I would turn off the live link and then update it. Oh. There we go, that's fine. Yeah, so something like that is okay. So we can use this block. So it's not actually right, but for the purposes of it, if that was like the brick that you'd worked out was the right size, you could then use that brick to scale your texture, and then you can use the offset tools. So then, yeah, so essentially it means you can scale your brickwork and then copy it over. The next one I'd like to is this, so you can replace your own. So if you don't like the bricks or any textures you've got in Lumion, you can download your own. And there's a load of websites that will have free textures, or you can download 5 free a month. So you can just find them online. So essentially, it means you can create your own. I think this is probably the best way to get real, like realistic textures. And I won't go into it now, but you can also make normal maps and displacement maps, which I've got here. So if you're interested in that, you just look up a tutorial. As you can see, this is way too glossy, so it looks like it's like a plastic or something. So you're going to bring that down, and then so it's like, you see that's like the reflectivity is like how much light it'll show. So that will also slow down your render. So if you're worried if your render's taking a long time, check your reflectivity of materials which aren't like mirror or like glass, because if they're kind of quite high, you might not realize, but they'll slow down your renders. And then you'll see, I don't know how well you can see that, but if you look here, the relief, so it's using the bump map. The relief is like how bumpy it is. Let's see. Weathering, so that's a good one for your materials. I just try and make it look a bit more lived in and real instead of everything being shiny and polished. Is add a slight bit of weathering onto your so for the materials. So obviously that's the extreme, and obviously it looks hideous, but a slight subtle amount just gives it some kind of shadows and softer edges, which help. Okay, and I'll quickly show emissions. So for instance here I've got a brickwork design, so it's imagine like an LED trim sitting on inside. So if you have a chosen material, you can add an emission, and essentially it's something that glows. So you can create your own light sources in Lumion, or you can add them as well. So if you're thinking, if you've downloaded, say, SketchUp, something from the 3D warehouse, like hanging lights or lamps or something, you can change it so each one of them will emit the same amount of light, and you don't have to go around adding light bulbs onto each of them as you go. And then so move into the photo kind of mode.
What websites do you usually use for finding textures and stuff like that to add to them?
To be honest, I've not got too many which I use on a regular. I usually will just kind of search around for a little bit, but I remember there's a few. I'm blanking on names, but there's a few that are essentially very similar. You can download 2D and 3D.
I think there's textures.com. I think that might be the name of one of them. Yeah. And that works on credits, but you get like so many free downloads a day. I know that one's pretty good.
Yeah. So setting up a scene. So this is Lumion's kind of like essentially photo mode. Past them. So the way I always like to set up my images is so it's got a very easy user face, and honestly it reminds me of Sims a lot. Like you kind of click on your people, and ideally they're on different layers, so you can turn them off and on.
How is it you move people onto layers and stuff like that?
So essentially, it's just like Photoshop, really. So it's when you clicked into it, so you'll see can't hide active layer. So it'll just be which you can see the difference when it's got the gradient, if that's what you've clicked on. So it's not super advanced. You can't do any like layer filters. It just means you can separate your elements, especially if you're doing big kind of models with master planning or different SketchUp models. It means you can turn them off when you're modeling and when you're creating. So for instance, if I was setting up the scene, I would probably do the people, then turn them off, and then do the cars, because it will slow down. The more you add, especially trees and like landscaping, can really slow down your program. So setting up a scene, essentially you can move around. It's like a video game, and you set up your photo. And if you look, so here's your height. So I think your eye level should always be roughly person height. So 1.6, 1.7, 1.8, something around there. And then your focal length. So when you come in, it's at 15 mil, which is kind of quite a wide angle. And around about 22 is like the human focal length. So if like you're a person standing, that's your field of vision. It's slightly different because like we have like kind of like blurry bits on the side, but that's close to what you're going to get. So right there, you can set up a scene. It takes a photo, and you can do a whole range of photos very quickly. I always like to set up mine with some sort of clipping, so something where it's got a foreground element, a background element, and then your midground, which is usually your sort of focus point. So you can quite quickly do your realistic render. So it's a preset render, which is quite good, and you saw before. But I think as you work into it, you'll come to sort of realize what you prefer to use, and just playing about with them, I think, is the easiest way to understand, instead of being told like one way to set it up. Because I think generally for each render, depending on the sun and what you're rendering and what you're trying to show in your render, is worth kind of playing about with them. So this is one that I just set up earlier. I'll run through a couple of the filters or layers that I've got. As you can see, the more layers you add, the slower it'll be. So the first one is depth of field, which is quite an important one. So with the edit, you can set your depth of field. So as I've got it here currently. So that's where your focal point is going to be. So where you want people to be looking at is where you'll set it. And it means that you can blur and fade elements. So say you turn that all the way up. See, focus on it's not quite right. Set it so it means that elements that aren't supposed to be in focus kind of soften, and it really highlights the main feature, which is usually your building. And then go into shadows. I think you should also have soft shadows on. I think one thing that makes a render look really like a computer render is hard shadows. So for instance there, you're never gonna get shadow that hard in real life, because essentially the further away the light source is, the more diffused it'll be. So it'll have a softer shadow. So it's a lot more realistic. Omni shadow, I always turn up full shadow correction and interior exterior. Essentially the Omni shadow just kind of gives it some elements towards corners, so you can kind of see the darkness there. And then coloring and brightness is basically how blue you want your shadows to be, and then how you want really dramatic. So it can change basically how dark and how light you want your shadows. I think it'll all depend on how bright your sun is and what time of day it is and what month. Color correction is one that I go based on the personal image. So there's it's almost like a pre-Photoshop. So I won't go into it, but you can essentially play about these as you please to show you wanting it to feel warm, a warm sunny day, cold or like a morning sun or kind of like a summer afternoon. This is where you get kind of play about with temperature, tint, vibrancy, contrast, brightness. Reflection is an important one. I won't show you because it's quite slow to do, but essentially, if you want more realistic reflections that reflect directly what it should reflect off of, similar way you edit, you click your glass elements, and then that will basically tell the Lumion that this is a reflection plane, so it will reflect the cars and whatnot. So all these have been set up so that all the glasswork here is reflection plane. And when you have a lot of different filters in it, sometimes can be a bit slow to change over. So one of the big ones is sun study. I think this is one of the great, especially if you've got tutors who are asking, is that sun real? Because I think quite often renders, you can just pick a good sunlight. So you set, the day, the hour, the month, and you can also change the location. So if you go, yeah, so essentially you can set your global location, and it's not incredibly accurate, but it's kind of good enough. So you say it's Dundee, you kind of go somewhere there, and then that means you can render something, and if the tutor asks, is this a real sun, or is this you just trying to show off? And you can go, no, this is 4:30 on the 21st of April. And the big one's 2-point perspective. Essentially, you should always have your verticals being straight for external images, otherwise it just reads wrong. I think so if you're looking up, it feels like you're a lot shorter compared to, so that's image without 2D. So 2-point perspective, so right now these are having a vanishing point miles up, which doesn't really happen in real life to the same extent or as steep. And so I've got these two images here, which I'll show later. So you can copy over your styles, and you can save your custom styles. So one thing I do is, once you've played about with your filters and you found one that you like, save it. So I've got this saved as like Dundee, afternoon sun, whatever. So I've got these two images here set up, which I will render at the same time, and they're essentially, if you keep your point of view the same and you tilt up, you can render two images, which you can then combine in Photoshop. So it means you can, if you want a square image, it means you'll have the right field of view. Sometimes if you want a square image, you make it too wide, so you can crop the sides off and it looks wrong.
So that you move the camera, is it just with the mouse?
Yeah, so it's just, need to be very subtle with it. So I'm going to render these two images, and as you can see, you should try and get them to line up as best you can, but the Photoshop should kind of correct it. And then two things I also like to use are the save material map ID, and then the sky alpha map, and I'll show you what those are later. Then you've got different resolutions. I would usually go for desktop, sometimes print, and poster. You'll be there all day, so it goes up like by 4 times really. So it's like 16 times as long to go for poster compared to desktop. And I think for most, especially online, desktop's more than enough, because you'll end up compressing it for a hand in anyway. these two are, so we're looking at the material map. So this I like to use as a way to mask elements. So quickly, instead of having to trace anything you want to replace or change, you can use this as a mask tool. So, and then the same, you can do it with your sky. So if you want to replace your sky with an image, you don't have to go around tracing your building because you've rendered it, and this you've got the sky kind of alpha. It shows you can just select and create a mask for your sort of chosen sky material or texture. So this one here is something I rendered earlier. So it's taken from Lumion and then it's open straight into it. One thing I'll show you quickly is, so if you look at automate here, you can merge two photos. And generally, Photoshop's pretty good at doing it. So, let's just see if you pick two of the same. Yeah. And I just use auto because it's pretty smart with the way it does it, and it blends the two together. It takes a little minute. Yes, as you can see, so it's found the points which join together, combined it. So it means you've got a photo with a better kind of aspect ratio, and if you want to crop a square photo, you've not got the need to make such a wide angle, which can look kind of disconcerting. So firstly so there's your material map. So you can also use it for sky as well. So I've chosen here, and as you can see, you can fix, so something like there's just, you've got the tree as well, you can just fix it. So sometimes, if they're not lined up, just make it transparent and adjust it so it does. It gets the point. There we go. So you create a mask here, and so I've just downloaded a sky here, and I've deliberately shown it as one that doesn't really fit the setting. So if you want to check your mask at the density, this is essentially like the mask. It's the how much you can see and how much isn't, and then you can also turn it down as well. One thing I forgot to mention was I always like to, when I'm starting rendering, is duplicate my original image and lock it. So that's like my kind of save, my background. So if you've done, I prefer to work in a system where you don't really delete things, you can copy over them. But if you do something destructive that you can't go back, you can use the sort of saved locked one to check and go, have I taken this render too far or whatnot. So I'll quickly show you what I like to do with, in terms of adjustment layers. So I think it's the most important tip for rendering is not to use your adjustments here. So these ones, it's like a one-time thing, and you can't, so once it's done, you can't change it later. But if you make an adjustment layer, for instance, you can change it after the fact. So it should be on this left-hand side, right-hand side, if you're set up in the right space. And so currently, if you just click, so each one of them, there's a few different ones that I use often, so I'll show you as I go, but the best thing was just to try and learn it yourself, and just every time, because it can be a little bit confusing with the little icons, but essentially you kind of learn quickly what they all do. So right now, so you've got a adjustment layer. So if you select into it, you can adjust as you please. So it's a bit like when you do adjustments beforehand, but it's live and you can change it. So you can have it. You can do it. It exists in two ways. So one, you can have it as just an adjustment layer, so it adjusts everything below it. So all these layers are getting adjusted. Then you can also, if you right-click, you create clipping mask, which means it only adjusts the thing directly below it. So then I can adjust. So for instance, just the sky. So and you can try and get the match. And this just means that you can play about with things a lot better and very quickly change, instead of having to try and do an adjustment here and then you realize you've gone too far but you can't go back. This way you can change everything as long as you please. You can go back, and even if you want to come back to it later, it's all still there. And so it's got curves. Essentially, it's like your brightness levels, so the lightest and darkest points. Again, so if you lower it, that'll make it into. So I'm just going to very quickly show you me essentially playing about with these layers to try and get the sky to look a bit more natural. I think this all just comes from practice. And so there, that's very quickly taken, say, so that's the image as is. And it just doesn't look right. And then I think quite quickly you've shown something. It obviously isn't completely realistic, but it's better than it was, and it fits in with the colors and the color grading of the rest of your image. So I'll continue this with looking at the brickwork. So we can use our material mask. So you can use the select, if you're going to select your color range. So you can do it that way, and it'll sample. Yeah, so currently now it's sampling all layers, but you do, so if you select current layers, color range. And the fuzziness is essentially how close the color has to be to match. So the lower it is, the stricter it will be. The white is what's going to be highlighted, and then the black isn't. So as you can see, this blue is very slightly different to this blue. And as you increase the fuzziness, it'll start to pick up other similar colors. So we can then use this as an adjustment layer mask. So if we turn that one off, so you got your brickwork, and say you don't like the color. Once you've selected using your mask, so you can also just use a quick select. You then create, so as you can see there, it's taken that selection and created an adjustment layer mask. So that's only once we create a clipping layer mask, it'll only look below, and it will only adjust the place in white. So I can play about with individual elements as I please. And I think each one of these skills is not a specific steps, it's more the process that you need to learn, or can learn for your own individual one. So you can see, you can quite quickly really adjust what and how your images looks. So I think, for instance, if you want a much more bright or much darker and saturated. And I think this is the way I've learned is primarily self-taught, and it's just by exploring and changing and just seeing how each individual piece works and how that can benefit your image. One thing we'll look at is motion blur. So you can do motion blur in Lumion. It's a bit of a faff to do, but you can do it. So it means, as you can see, I've set it up here. So this car, you see it kind of gives the experience that it's moving. I'll show you how to do it quickly in Photoshop. So you're going to use magnetic lasso. Brace. Oh, so obviously in your own one, you'll be doing this slightly more finally to make sure you get in every element. But just for this, I'll kind of quickly go around it. And the way I like to do it is, so I copy. So if you do, you can do Control and V. You then copied what you've highlighted. I'm going to make a folder called Cars. Essentially, I've got this in here, as well as what's already an image. See, that's it there. So if you go to Filter and then Blur, which is motion blur, and then you have two options, which is one is direction. So if you think these cars are driving this way, and then the distance. So that essentially is like how far it's got the motion blur. So you can make it incredibly long or very subtle. So you get something, you can actually go back and change this. Is one of the things you can like turn it back down. But the way I like to work is having two motion blurs, so one on the image and then a second one which kind of behind. So if you know, like kind of like a cartoon speed line, it's like there's like a shadow of where it was. And you think if you're taking photography, it's just because your shutter speed is too slow to pick up the car. And then just by adjusting the opacity and then like how it hits. So I'd explore every single one of these and how it can affect the image. Essentially, if you just click through them very quickly, you can see which one you think best fits. So it just got darkened slightly. And this isn't perfect because I'm just running through it. So in practice, you spend a little bit longer working on it. So you can do the same thing. So you can do it with cars, people. So say like a cyclist, obviously. So the faster the object will be moving, the more it has. So for instance, like the guy on the bike, you can just very quickly run random. He's moving in the same direction. That's just way too much. So just a tiny little bit. Just gives it a little bit. So it's also a way of taking focus off these individual elements. And then we'll forward. Next, so we're talking about people. So these ones, so as you can see, the 3D models are behind, and then the 2D ones from Lumion. You can also add in people after the fact, which, especially if you're doing something which you're going to make more post-production, so it's not entirely realistic. If you add people in after the fact, it means you can kind of adjust how they hit and whether they're black and white or translucent or whatnot. So one thing I would suggest is create your own library of people. So it means you don't have to, every time you're doing a render, you don't have to go back and find new people or new textures online. You can go into your own individual library. And one thing I really suggest doing is saving the images by the name. So by basically what the people look like and what they're wearing. Because if you're doing a cold winter snowy one, it makes no sense to have folk in shorts and t-shirts. You want people with jackets and like umbrellas if it's raining. So if you say this image as two people walking summer or warm weather, it means you can search your own library very quickly and find, you can type in cold weather or jackets or raining, and it means you don't have to run through. So as you can see, so they've got so this image I downloaded, they've got a white background. So I'll show you a tip quickly. So again, grouping stuff makes it helpful. I'll show you a tip grouping. So if you click into, so we'll name these, people walking. So if you click into the layer, here you've got this layer. So this essentially is what it's going to show. So the colors get converted to black and white, and it will. If you adjust this layer, the slider, it'll be whether it's going to show it or not show it. So like this is the darkest and the lightest. So it means you can very quickly take out the white, or if it was a black or something, And it's not always perfect, but it means you can quite quickly do it and then adjust it later. And this is a really great one to get for if you're downloading Digimaps. So you can use a black and white filter. So you see each color. So say if you Digimap filter, you can quickly change. So the reds are really dark, and then the greens are really dark for your landscape or whatnot. But then you don't want the roads. And then you can use that to very quickly trace. So you don't have to click and trace around each individual building or street. You can use a combination of the black and white filter to quickly get what you're looking for. So these two people here, we're going to so Control T is transport, and you can do it here. And you're going to want to fit them into the setting. So I find you want to create an eye level. So if you think everyone should have roughly the same eye level, obviously, so the street isn't even, but if it's a flat plane, then everyone should be about the same eye level. But then if there's a slope, then you can kind of set your own one, so people at each level should slowly be roughly similar. So these people here, will have them sitting or sort of walking in front of the building. So you're going to want to try and adjust, and also you can look at their head sizes as well. If they're not at the same level, you can try and so they look about right. So obviously, I would normally sort of go around and take the border, but for this, I'm not going to bother doing it just because it takes a little bit of time. So right now, they look all right, but they're way too bright and they're way too saturated. So the same is going to create adjustment layers. And then you're going to means you can very quickly, so you can zoom in and do it, and then you can also look back and just play around with it, so you can try and see, try and get them embedded into the scene. Situations. One thing I actually didn't do was if you merge, so once you've used the adjustment here to take away the white, you can merge it down. One second. quickly go back to what we were at. So again, so you create an adjustment layer, create clipping layer mask, and then you just use all of these and just play about with it, and you'll be able to kind of embed the people. So even already there, that makes a big difference. Next one's obviously, because they're not in the render, they're not going to have shadows. So you can, if you either just duplicate, so that's broken. Yes, if you copy something it's now broken the clipping layer because you put something in the way. So you need to make sure, so we swap these around. And back to see the arrow there, that means it's the clipping layer mask. So also if you do control and click on the layer, it'll select everything in the layer. So it's a quick way to select the whole entire layer. And then you can either go to fill, or if it's a sort of smaller size, we can just turn them black. And then we will go and use transform. So there's a couple of different options. So this is to create a shadow for the people. Use a perspective tool and so adjust in different ways. I end up probably using a couple of different versions, but I think generally the distort tool is quite useful way. So essentially, sometimes it doesn't quite work, but you basically want to have their feet sort of touching the shadows. So you can use either. It's not done great. So essentially use probably the distort tool and then also the warp and perspective and use it. So if you're doing something which is like a new shadow, basically just try and look at the shadows of the things in the model and how they look. Right now we've got the there. Doesn't look quite right. So one thing we'd use is mask out the elements that you wouldn't see. So a quick way to do a mask is so if you selected the area, normally if you go and create mask there, the Photoshop will think that's where you want to keep it. So instead of having to go all the way around it, you can do that, and then if you do Control I, it inverts the mask, so you can see there. So it means you can very quickly. So right now it's black with the only white bit being there. And then if you do Control I, it inverts it. So that's the only bit that's black, so you can't see it. And then the way shadows work in real life is they're not actually black, they darken. So lower the color value of whatever it is. So I always go darken, and then use based on how bright the sun is over how dark the shadows are, and just use it, try and look at other shadows around. Look. One more tip I use for people to get them set into the model is, as you can see, these people here, because these ones are in the render, they've got shadows on themselves as well. You can see his neck and head is getting shadow from here, but they don't. So you can kind of mimic it with the burn and dodge tool. Essentially, what happens with these is it plays with exposure. So I would use a soft brush tool. So it's this. You could do the same thing with an adjustment layer and just by painting it in. That means you can. I don't know how well this comes up. Maybe if we just make it a bit more extreme. but you can essentially, so people towards the sun will be brighter, and then the stuff that's in the shadows will be darker. So by using the dodge tool, you can lighten elements, so like the faces and things that we're pointing your light source, and then burn will darken it. So it's not perfect, but you know, with a bit more time, you can see how that can embed like the images you've added into the render. And I think typically, you know, people is most common element people add in, but you could use trees or graffiti or stains. One thing I like to use for buildings, just to give them a bit more realism, is say so like if you look up, say, like grunge dirt stains or something, generally grunge is kind of buzzword for the Photoshop pieces, so this one was just off of Google Images, and it was, I think, like wall stains, like PNG. If you type PNG, you'll generally get transparent. So I've downloaded this one without going all the way in, so you can see it's still got the like the kind of transparent texture. So again, you can use, you click into it, use it to take away. So it means you can do this all sorts. You know, if you're downloading images which have like watermarks on them, use that to try and get rid of it. And we'll quickly adjust there with perspective. So essentially, you can use it in two ways. First way I'll show you is this perspective tool here. So you want to try and line it up, and especially if you've rendered it with 2D perspective, it makes it a lot easier because everything's in 2D. So it's like an orthographic drawing from. And then the way it hits it is the most important piece. Obviously, that looks absolutely horrible, but by playing about with pieces of, there's maybe a bit of an extreme version, but just, you know, it's the principle you can use. So especially good ways when it touches the ground plane is often quite so, whether it's going to be dirt or staining. I think it's just a way to kind of build an image that feels like it's been lived in. It's not a brand new image. Another one I quite like to use is, so you can download a bunch of different. So I've got here some sunshine brushes, which essentially work as. I'm trying to find a good one. Yeah, so that one there. So if we go into a new layer, so you can use that as an image almost. So instead of a brush tool, adjust it in a similar way. So I'm using here, start to play about with it. I think that's kind of just about it. I'd say the main principles really is playing and exploring different options. Use adjustment layers so that it's a non-destructive. So it means all these changes I've made, I can go back and revert or adjust. And it means if you're constantly doing layer adjustments here, there's no way of going back and looking at the original or playing about with it. I think that's really kind of just about it. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. One thing actually was, I know people like to use grain for images, and I think it's quite a tricky kind of element to use, but I think if you're doing a realistic image, it helps to add a slight bit of grain on the image just to balance elements. So like the people here, that without a bit of grain, they stick out a little bit more. I think so. If you go, so say you can also, what I quite like to do is group the whole image like this is towards the end of the process, and then like flatten or duplicate and then flatten. So it means you can save it as an individual image, but you've still got that group there. And you go, is it noise? And yeah, so I think you should really be very cautious with it, because I think it very quickly can ruin an image. I think a slight bit of grain. What you can also do is, if you want to play with how the grain looks, if you duplicate the layer that you're going to apply the grain to, and so right now, obviously, it's all the colors, and it's so you've got uniform and then Gaussian, which I prefer. It's kind of slightly more dispersed, and then so essentially this layer is the same as that one, but minus the grain. You can then sort of adjust it as you please. So, like, for instance, you have it so you only see grain in the darker places, and the white is left exposed. This plays about, and it really helps to basically kind of embed other elements into your image. So it's a lot more subtle, where you can only really see it in certain elements. But especially if you're presenting online, I'd always, whatever you think the grain looks good on your computer, turn down a little bit, because when you're presenting with the compression, is it generally sort of pixelated more, so any grain that you've got, it looks bigger and stronger when your tutor or someone else is looking at it, like online. I think that's just about it, Ross.
Lucy's asking, can you quickly show how the adjustment layer works so that it just affects one layer?
Okay, yeah, so here I think on my setup band. So I'm set up just in essentials, so just like your default, and you've got it here, so the properties and then adjustments.
And
so
to get
these are so these are all of them same. They're basically the same as the adjustments and image, and when you hover, it'll tell you what they are. So if you click into one, you've got a white mask, and you can then adjust your mask however you please. So say, whatever you like. Yes, you can see, and then if you click into it, that's how you adjust it as you please. And then if you right click and do create clipping mask, that means you'll see a little arrow there, which means it'll only focus on the image below, so it won't edit any of the other ones. And you can also, what you can do is, a good one is you can create a group, and you can essentially create clipping mask for a group. So that's a really good one for, say, people. So you add all your people in at the same time, put them in a layer, and then adjust the whole group as one. So they'll all be the same, and you don't have to copy and paste and redo each time you put a new person in.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much, Brendan. If anyone else has any questions, if you just want to fire them into the chat, and if not, then I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks a lot for that. And on Lumion as well, I know, because I've done this, that you can adjust the settings of the program to help suit like your laptop or your computer.
Oh yeah, that's a great point.
It's good to show, because I know that like my laptop is not that quick, but you can still use it, which is kind of like quite a nice benefit.
Yeah. So two things essentially. Lumion is it's like a graphics rendering program. So if you're ever rendering stuff, you need to keep the program open. It can't render in the background. And if it is getting too slow, one thing they said is, once you've put elements in different layers, turn them off. And you can turn them on in photo mode. So if you go just add an effect and delay visibility, so you don't even actually ever have to turn them on again if it slows you down that much, and you only need to turn them on for the image. And like Ross said, is if you go into settings is similarly to like InDesign. So essentially, how your images are like low quality while you're working in it, is you can turn down your quality of as it runs around. So that's at like at the maximum. You know, it's absolutely horrible quality. But if you're working on a big model, then and you've not got an amazing PC or laptop, it can really help, and it doesn't affect the final image. It just means it's a lot quicker to run around in. One thing up here is that's actually your FPS there, so it'll come up in red if it's too slow. I think if there's anything else. I think the most part is just explore and just see. So you've got all these different ones, and a few are pretty essential. Like I've said, like your reflections, setting your sun, 2D perspective. But then there's also, there's ones here I quite like to use. It's like styrofoam. So essentially, you can use it for like concept models. Go back. Yeah, so you can, if you've not even got textures or people, you can just make a kind of concept model that very quickly, there's all sorts of things you can do. You can really, it's a kind of very playful render, and just not one of the ones where you have to make sure every single setting is right and then kind of pray that it'll work. You can quickly, and I think if you ever, what I end up usually doing is probably rendering 12 or 10 or 12 times just in like the smallest quality, and then just looking at it and adjusting it as I go until I find how I want my effects to line up. So it makes like the best image possible. I think the key is that you're selling your project or your building, and you're telling a story with each image. Is that you need to think about what your image says before you do it, and then how your composition, your colors, the sort of sun, how all these things affect and sell this idea that you're trying to show.
Another question is, any recommendations for rendering instead of Lumion? Because my laptop can't hack it.
You can, I think, probably, if you're really struggling, as I'll quickly show. Also, one thing that's really a nightmare to do is to go from SketchUp to Lumion, because the controls are different. You end up, it kind of ruins your head. I'll see if I can quickly demo this. But I'd say V-Ray is quite good for SketchUp. But even just essentially, you can just do a SketchUp straight to it. So by using different styles, so essentially, if I'm going to do a render, so basically like a Photoshop render taken from a SketchUp, is I'd export 3 images. So one being essentially almost like a material map. So you could have it with these materials, or you could, like I said before, just have different colors and use it as a material map and replace them in Photoshop. So I'd export one like this. Then I'd go onto a white model. Then I'd export one with just the lines, so the edges here. And you can export 2D graphic, and you can put the lines down so you can make them 0.5 so nice and light, and then adjust it so it's a sort of big quality image. And with nice thin lines, because I think sometimes the SketchUp lines can be quite thick and a bit pixely. So by upping the size and the scale, you end up with thin lines. And then turning on your shadows, and especially so if it's been geolocated, so here you can add location, same as Lumion. You can then turn on shadows, and this is a little bit slow for for SketchUp. On shadows, and it should. Yeah, and then you can adjust the time and date, and then I'd go back up your style and turn off lines. Just a second. And then you've got your shadows. So then if you've exported those three, you can take them into Photoshop and play with them. So then you've got your shadows that are real. Then you've got your textures, which you can adjust or replace as you please. And you've also got your lines for whether or not you want to use them or highlight certain elements. And I think it'd be that or like V-Ray extensions in SketchUp. But I'm not an expert in that by any means.
Yeah.
Also, just one thing I use. So this toolbar here. It's called 0110 Architecture Tools, I think. And essentially, it's got a load of different options. So it's got some like AutoCAD features, like fill it in like chamfer and things, then like arrays and even like staircase builders or louvers or all sorts. So it's one to download and explore.
Yeah, that's great.
That's about it, Ross.
Yeah, I think that's all of us from the questions. Also, definitely worth noting that in like visualization in SketchUp, go as well as this workshop, like go onto YouTube and just like search what you want to do. There's definitely tons and tons of stuff out there.
Yeah, there's a lot better than me.
Yeah, there's so much. It's just about like finding your own.
Yeah, there's a channel called Show It Better that does a lot of rendering, so a combination of Lumion or SketchUp or Illustrator and all sorts. And he's got some good stuff.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed. And next week we have Craig taking us through a little bit of Rhino and some Blender, which is another style of rendering, quite good for rendering like physical models. So I hope to see you there. But that's all for this evening. So thank you very much, and thanks again to Brendan.